I think you guys are the only thing between us and beer at this point. For our last panel, a lot of us are some of us are going to be focusing on, we've talked a lot about how virtue ethics and character kind of works and doesn't work. We're going to kind of focus a little bit, I think, on, so what would it look like if a service tried to adopt it programmatically and practically and use it to inform the professional ethic? Also get into some other practical aspects of, how one, operationalizes, for lack of a better word, a lot of the things we were talking about today. And so in that vein, we've got Colonel Geoff Catlett, who is the director of the Center for the Center for the Army's Profession and Ethic at the United States Military Academy. And he'll be telling us about how the Army program works. I will go next, and I will talk a little bit about some of the issues that arise when you're implementing these kinds of programs and touch on a lot of things I think that we've talked today. Susan Martin, who is a cognitive research scientist at the Army War College, will talk about a study that we've done on how one might go about assessing the success or failure of these kinds of programs. And then we have Mitt Regan, who's the McDevitt Professor of Jurisprudence and co-director of the Center for the Study of the Legal Profession at Georgetown University Law Center. We'll be talking about neuroscience, emotion, and military ethics. On that triple note, sir.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and essentially give the Army's answer to many of the questions that have been brought up in the conference today. So, CAPE, the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic, it was founded roughly 10 years ago at the behest of then Secretary of the Army John McHugh and Chief of Staff of the Army George Casey. And the reason for finding CAPE was because they were very concerned about what year after year of continuous combat, continuous warfare was doing to the force. Not just simply in terms of the physical deterioration due to this rapid R4 gen of 12 months in theater and 12 months back, but what was there a moral attrition that was happening as well? Remember, this is post Abu Ghraib, post Black Hearts, if you're familiar with that horrible incident in the Army. And so they charged the new organization to answer three fundamental questions. First, who are we? What does it mean to be an Army soldier? Second, why do we fight? What are those moral principles that we stand for and that govern ourselves in combat? And then thirdly, how do we fight? What are the values, not just doctrinally, but I mean, what are the values that govern our actions on the battlefield, in war, and in preparation for war? And then the implied question in that was, then how do I develop soldiers and leaders who understand the answers to those questions, have internalized it, and then are able to execute in that way on the battlefield? And so what we discovered at the very beginning of this process was that the Army had always considered itself a profession, but we had no clear articulation of what that actually meant. Depending on the audience and the time, it had many definitions. So we needed a clear articulation of what it meant to be a profession and a professional. And then secondly, every profession has an ethic, this set of moral principles that guides its decisions and actions. The rules, as Dr. Doris was talking about this morning, those rules that actually govern behavior. And then while we also recognize that we are exceptionally good at developing leaders of competence and leaders who are committed, we didn't necessarily have a clear answer as how do we develop leaders of character to execute all this on the battlefield. So we needed a very more clear, intentional, purposeful way of understanding character development. So those are the things that I'm going to talk to you about in a very short time. Forgive me for probably a lack of nuance as I just try to cover a lot of ground here. So what does it mean to be a profession? And in our study and looking at various other professions, we recognized that there are essentially four fundamental characteristics of a profession. Of all professions, and we specifically then articulated in terms of an Army profession. So first and really foremost is honorable service, the idea of being an honorable servant, that this is not a job, that this is a higher calling, that we serve for the, in service of the Republic that we stand for, and that it is a noble calling to service and sacrifice. Secondly, military expertise, that we are military experts, that we provide a expertise in an area that society can find nowhere else. It is a unique subject matter and a unique service to society. And then thirdly, stewardship, being a steward of the profession, that a professional has a reverence for the resources that are provided to them and treats them and uses them responsibly, maturely, and such. And that's not just material resources, that is the sons and daughters of America that are given to us, that we treat them as the most valued resource that we have. But then the third part of being a profession or a steward of a profession is that you recognize that you are responsible for the profession itself, that you nurture it, that it is a fragile thing, and that it can be broken if not taken care of. So you are nursing the profession itself or stewarding the profession itself in there. And then finally, that fourth characteristic is esprit de corps, the winning spirit. America does not pay us to just show up on the battlefield and get a trophy. America pays us to show up on the battlefield and win. So those three roles, all animated by that esprit de corps and winning spirit, they have an outcome. They have a commodity that we all, I think, recognize as foundational to everything that we do, and that is trust. Trust between ourselves as the Army and the American people, trust between ourselves and the civilian oversight that we have, trust internally with each other, and then trust with our family. So being a profession and a professional is critical to creating the environment of trust, the culture of trust that allows us to be the best Army in the world. So I said before, too, that all professions have an ethic, a set of moral principles that guides the decisions and actions of the Army professionals. An Army ethic, an ethic functions as an ethical handrail that we follow in making our decisions and actions. I won't go through each of the 10 moral principles. They're tied to each of the roles that I just described of honorable servant, Army experts, and stewards of the profession. But I will articulate what I think are the common themes that you'll find throughout them and what they mean for us. First and foremost is your duty to contribute your best effort to accomplish the mission, to do what is right to the best of your ability, and to strive for excellence. To serve with honor, to be truthful, fair, and uphold the Army ethic. To serve with loyalty, to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States of America. Service, to contribute to the well-being and benefit of others through cohesive teamwork. Respect, to demonstrate regard for the intrinsic dignity and worth of all people. Integrity, to make right decisions and take right actions. And then finally, the courage to do what is right despite risk, uncertainty, and fear. So now talking about character. Much of the discussion today has sort of focused on the idea of the failure, essentially, of a virtues-based approach to character development. And I think that's because we focus on the individual and self-development and this idea of your intrinsic character, your true nature, your identity and sense of purpose, values, virtues, and so on. But, to quote a famous English monarch, I can't build windows into men's souls. I can't really see your true nature. So we have to have an operational definition of character, and that is, as I have repeatedly said, it is your dedication and adherence to the Army ethic as reflected in your faithful demonstration in your decisions and actions. I can judge that, I can see that, and I can shape that. So when we talk about character, we're not talking about the intrinsic part. We hope that there is a process that, virtue practice is virtue gained. But again, I'm focused on the operational side. And so we develop character. It's a continuous process. And here's the key part. Leaders own character development. Character development is a leadership responsibility. The interaction of character development is a continuous process between leader and led. And it happens in various circumstances, in education, in training, and in experience. But it can only happen if a leader understands his responsibility to develop character. And so we created in 2017, we published a white paper that we're currently updating now into Doctrine. and it posits this framework for character development. And essentially, it looks at 3 levels of leadership that are mutually supportive and interdependent, and that all 3 have to act in concert if you're actually going to develop character in an individual. If you look down at the bottom, the one that we're sort of used to, and we talk about character most of the time, is my individual responsibility through self-development to develop character, and then also the direct leader's responsibility through coaching, counseling, and mentoring to help you develop character. And all 3 of those activities are often used in the same term, but they're 3 distinct activities that a leader needs to understand their role in each of those. But you have to put it in the broader environment. And again, the social context here of character development. You have to understand that even the most moral individual, if placed in an immoral or amoral environment, their values and attitudes will be shaped by that environment. Character will develop, and if you don't intentionally develop it well, it will be developed in ways that you will not find very helpful. So the professional organizational climate that the individual and the direct leader are involved in, and their rewarding character or rewarding intervention where bad character is developed, is also critical in the process of character development. And then finally, at the institutional strategic level, a culture of trust, that the policies, programs, initiatives, all the role modeling of senior leaders, all of those things creating a culture of trust that reinforce and reward professional organizational climates, and create environments in which cynicism doesn't breed because you don't believe the institution has your best interests at heart. All of that is also critical to character development. So you have to see things through the lens of these 3 levels of leadership and understand that they all have to interact and in concert together in order to develop character in an individual. And I think it's telling. We often use these words culture and climate interchangeably, but they're very distinct, and you have to understand that to really get it, this idea of character development. General Williams, the superintendent of West Point, recently said, "We have a problem with the culture at West Point." And if he had asked my opinion, I would have told him the culture at West Point is fine. The institution's culture is enduring and fine. You have a problem of climates at West Point. There are subcultures, which is a euphemism for an organizational climate that is not adhering to the values of the institution that you have. And then they are then corroding the values of the individuals who are part of those climates. So that's the Army's framework for character development. So how are we implementing that across the force? Through the Army campaign plan, we're looking, again, corresponding to 3 levels of leadership. What are the things that we can do at the institutional, organizational, and the individual level to implement or reinforce this idea of character development? At the institutional level, again, looking at understanding the C leaders have to ask themselves, is the directive policy and program or system that I am initiating, is it not only effective and efficient, but is it ethical? And then also understanding that language matters, that we have to have a common vocabulary, a common lexicon of terms and terms of reference to talk about these things. So the discipline in our doctrine and our Army regulations and our procedures is critical. So culling through those and ensuring that they are really reflective. And then finally, strategic messaging. Are we attracting the right people to the organization? If it's only a transactional requirement, what do I get for serving, then how do you become a steward where you understand that you're responsible for the institution? And then quickly, at the professional climate level, we have to understand and come to a consensus as leaders and teach our leaders what is a professional organizational climate, how do you assess it, and then provide mitigating strategies if it is not doing what you want it to do. And then in organizational training, providing ethical challenges and observer controllers who can conduct after-action reviews that bring out the ethical lessons and learning points from that. And remember, too, this is another thing that we have to understand, and I think it's appropriate to the Service Academy culture here as well. Who owns character development at the United States Naval Academy? Who? No, everybody, right? If you're a physics professor at the Naval Academy, you own character development. If you're the football coach, you own character development. If you're a military instruction, I don't know what you guys, your military side of training, you own character development. And then you as midshipmen own character development. So it has to be integrated into everything that we do and recognized as part and parcel of everything we do. Apologize for the trick question. You guys are looking at me like, oh, another 50-year-old jackass. So, and then we have to certify. And then finally, at the direct level, I had a drill sergeant once tell me when he graduated from drill sergeant school, he was like, I have no doubts in my mind that I can train soldiers to win on the battlefield. Where I doubt myself is, can I inspire soldiers? So that means being transformational and not being just transactional. Do it because I told it to, or do it because I'm going to punish you, but do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it because you want to do it. Do it because you understand that. How do I develop direct leaders that do that? We have to embrace that as a responsibility. And then, of course, we have to assess, and that is always, in many ways, the most difficult thing. And then my last slide is, and this is on the CAPE website, which is not CAT card protected. It's open. You can't build leaders through a firewall. So you can all get, this is our latest training support package that we published, Character, Trust, and Mission Command. And essentially, it shows the relationship between character, competence, and commitment, and how it enables trust, and how it's essential to mission command and prevailing in large-scale combat operations. It really kind of teaches you everything that I just went over, or explains to you everything that I just went over in a very short 10, 15 minutes there. So I encourage you all to take a look at it. It's really a great product. So I hope that was helpful in understanding that that's the Army's answer to this idea of character. So thank you. I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. If you can pull up my slides, please. All right. Okay. Are we on?
Nope.
Anyway, I'll just go ahead and get started.
Give me the thing. Run it for you.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
All right. Well, anyway, we've been talking about a number of different approaches actually all day today, and I think one of the advantages of taking a character-based approach to ethics is it provides greater resources for addressing many of the shortcomings, and since we've used these words earlier today, I'll use them again, the deontological and consequentialist aspects of that are inherent in most professional ethical programs or conceptions. And why do you need to do that? Well, put briefly, the deontological systems, it's not always clear what the rules are, what they should be, and how to interpret them in every situation. And if you had all that, simply doing one's duty doesn't always capture the whole moral life of human beings. Consequentialist systems, as I think we probably all know, suffer from concerns associated with incommensurate goods, the ends justifying the means, among others. Now, virtue-based approaches, which I'm going to take as synonymous with the kind of character-based approaches that we're talking about here, ask the agent not to simply do one's duty or maximize some good, but rather ask, given any particular action or decision, what kind of person would do such a thing, and is that person a good person? Now, whether that's useful depends on how you handle the baggage that these kinds of approaches bring in. And we've talked a little bit about that today so far already. However, when considered, I think, and I'll get to that, but when considered in context with these other approaches, rather than opposition, I think it provides a more complete view of moral reasoning emerges. And that's the value added of the Army's emphasis on character as a part of the Army ethic. My point here is not going to be really to critique either the Army ethic or offer a more complete kind of virtue ethics, but I'd just like to look at some of the concerns that when you actually implement these kinds of programs, what kind of concerns these raise. And we've already talked about today, one is the difficulty in determining right action, which is a big criticism of character-based approaches. And it argues that it misses the point regarding what moral reasoning is for, guiding action. Moral philosophy is, or at least many argue that it should be concerned with practical issues. Fundamentally, it's about how we should act. However, it is for this emphasis on action that virtue ethics criticize the consequentialists and the deontological theories, typically for being too rigid and inflexible. Those favoring act-based approaches might in fact say, great, rigidity is in fact a strength and not a weakness of these systems, because they do offer clear action of what to do. As long as we know the principles, we can apply them to practical situations, be guided by them. Virtue ethics, some object, with its emphasis on being rather than doing, fails to give us any help with the practicalities of how we should behave. And a theory that fails to do that fails to be action guiding and is no good as a moral theory. So my first response is virtue ethics, it can be action guiding. And to give you an example of that, cue video.
Hey, what happened to Babs? She never showed up last night. The whole thing blew up in my face.
Ah, that's a shame.
Hey, what happened with Sandy? I forgot all about it. Did you call her?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I went over there.
So what happened? Did she throw you out, huh?
No, actually, she took it pretty well.
So what happened?
She's into it.
Into what?
The Menage. And not only that, she just called me. She told me she spoke with the roommate, and the roommate's into the Menage, too.
That's unbelievable!
Oh, it's a scene, man.
Do you ever just get down on your knees and thank God that you know me and have access to my dementia?
What are you talking about? I'm not gonna do it.
You're not gonna do it? What do you mean you're not gonna do it?
I can't. I'm not an orgy guy.
Are you crazy? This is like discovering plutonium by accident!
Don't you know what it means to become an orgy guy? It changes everything. I have to dress different. I have to act different. I have to grow a mustache and get all kinds of robes and lotions and... It's like I need a new bedspread, new curtains. I'd have to get thick carpeting and weirdo lighting. Plus, I'd have to get new friends. I'd have to get orgy friends. No, I'm not ready for it.
So next time, when someone asks me, is virtue ethics action guiding, I refer them to this. Because notice what Jerry says. At no point does he appeal to a rule, any rule for or against, nor does he care how many people are going to be made happy by his decision of the way, any other way. He says, this is not the kind of person I want to become, and because it's not the best kind of person that I could be. So, so character-based approaches, can provide us justifying reasons for our actions. And I would now, however, the question is raised: why not be the orgy guy? And to answer that, we need an account of human flourishing that makes sense of the claim that the habits and qualities of one way of life or one habit, a set of habits, are better or worse than the qualities of others. To the extent such an account can be given, then you have an action guiding approach. Now, that might be hard to do in context of human flourishing, but in the context of the profession, a professional context, it's a little easier to do because you don't to account for all the complexities that count as flourishing within the context of the profession. We know what the profession is for. We have as a result, we can have a pretty good articulation of what the good or the excellent professional looks like. So now the next way we could take this is say, well, we can set aside the concerns about virtue ethics or character-based approaches as a moral epistemology and look at it as a moral psychology. This was sort of the way that Kant took it, that where he saw virtues as efficacious for good behavior rather than a determinant. Virtues are habits, and if one does the right thing habitually, one will take on the character or the habits of the good person. Someone who habitually tells the truth, for example, and avoids lying is obviously honest. Here, virtue is more moral psychology than epistemology, which I think is kind of more the way we've structured the Army approach is structured, with its emphasis on the principles of the Army ethic. Now, of course, where the character is the motivation to uphold them. Now, of course, the issue here is there's always going to be an issue with determining what the full set of traits are to the extent you incorporate that into your approach. Aristotle listed 12, the Catholic Church has 7. I've read other accounts that list 40 or more. In theory, there's no end to the number of good qualities we can ascribe to someone in a particular setting. However, even if we are limiting ourselves to the psychological question, what kind of person upholds the ethic, we are still left with some implicit virtues, including prudence, which we've talked about, and conscientiousness, which has also come up, perhaps a few others. Now, related to this is the concern, I know in a lot of our discussions regarding the character program, we're frequently confronted with the objection of that you can't change character. That you are who you are, and character does very little. Character is not going to really fundamentally change over time. Now, I think that objection somewhat misses the point, because as we've described virtues are as much habit as anything else, and while habits can be hard to change, it's still possible to do so. But it does raise a point regarding command climate and setting conditions that encourage the right kind of habituation, which you've also touched on today. But for those of you who have read Lenny Wong's and Steve Garass's Lying to Ourselves, where they talk about how an overabundance of administrative requirements and training requirements got so bad that junior leaders were lying, filling out false reports saying that they had done these things because the alternative was to basically abuse their troops. So it's not so much the character can't change, it can, but if you want to habituate it, you've got to pay attention to the context and the climate in which it's exercised. And then the last thing I was going to mention here, we've talked a little bit about the unity of the virtues. But it's a fact, and we've again also touched on this, bad people can do the right thing. Moreover, good people can do a bad thing. Even more to the point, the same person can embody good traits in one sphere of human activity and not in others. One can be a great boss and a crappy father. In fact, evaluations of people in terms of their moral character as good, bad, or indeterminate are almost always epistemically unjustified. Which doesn't mean they're wrong, but it's very difficult to attribute a particular character to a person based on any particular behavior. Now, this point doesn't mean that people can't possess good character or bad character. It just means associating behavior with those traits is problematic. It's not uncommon for one to do well in one setting and poorly in others. And while this point would seem to work against the idea that the virtues are unified, it more accurately reflects, I think, human nature. In fact, I think these points are not incompatible. The virtues may be unified, but none of us possess them fully and are vulnerable to different kinds of temptations in different kinds of situations. And the point here is that while the Army ethic itself may not be aspirational, character is, and no one achieves it fully. So while it makes sense to set this as a goal, we want to avoid setting it up as a standard. So by emphasizing psychological resources character-based approaches afford, the Army emphasis on character provides a common approach that complements the Army ethic by emphasizing a commitment to the good, not just to the rules, and in doing so encourage Army leaders to adopt habits that result in better applications of the principles of the ethic. So I think that point's good. But the next thing I want to transition to is to Susan, who's going to talk about some of the issues we have, and okay, how do you know it's working? There you go.
While we're waiting for my first slide to show up, my cover slide, let me start with a couple of disclaimers. I was going to start this by saying, and now for something completely different. Following Tony, everything would be different. So, but just as I said, a couple of disclaimers. First of all, among this august group, I am not a philosopher. I am not a military officer. I'm not an ethicist. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a research psychologist at that. And so I want to get that out there first so that the approach that you're going to see me taking and the data that I'm going to be showing you is coming from a slightly different angle. As in, I'm not asking what's right and wrong, I'm just asking what is. What do the data say? And then what that means is something that is open to you. The other thing I want to say is that the data that I am going to be showing you is pilot data. It's very preliminary. I'm giving you this limitations of the data statement up front, and you'll see it in a big banner towards the very end of this again. We are going to be collecting significantly more data, I believe, in August of this year at the War College. But what we have now is sufficiently tantalizing that Dr. Pfaff asked me to come along and share it with you today. All right. So, knowing in advance, which you did not, that we were going to be honored by the presence of Jerry Seinfeld and his class and his cast, I felt moved to balance off those 4 members by bringing 4 different ones to the table with me. 3 of them you see here. The 4th one is the surprise. He comes at the end, and by far the best character of the group, I think. In any event, the first question is this idea of whether or not moral intelligence, as we're calling it, rather than moral character, although you'll see both terms used somewhat interchangeably throughout the presentation, and whether or not it can be developed. Well, we can go back a couple of thousand years to Aristotle, who's already been cited by others here. We can go to St. Ignatius Loyola, and we can take the approach, and we can take the position that as far as we know, give me a child until the age of 7 and I will show you the man. That character, as Dr. Pfaff just said, may in fact not be specifically or significantly changeable after some point. On the other hand, we can just go back 400 years to Goethe, and for those of you who don't speak German, zwei Seelen wohnen, ach, in meiner Brust. 2 souls live in my breast, says Dr. Faustus, who's about to make the worst deal of his life or anybody else's. And he talks about how these 2 souls are in a constant struggle with each other. The one aspiring to worldly goods, Lebenslust, and the other to higher things. It's an ongoing struggle. These are the 2 positions, and perhaps the truth, and I will leave this to the philosophers to decide. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what we do know is that character exists, and in whatever form, and at whatever time it was developed. When these midshipmen came into the Navy, when the cadets arrive at West Point, they already have character. We don't know how developed it is, and we don't know what it is, but whether they got it at 7 or they developed it, later on as they moved up into their later years, we know that they come with some form of character when they join the force. So, a little bit of background. For the last couple of years, I've been working at the U.S. Army War College, which, for those of you who are not aware, trains senior leaders. So primarily 05s and 06s, but the U.S. Army War College is also responsible for the training and development of general officers. So we offer courses for the incoming brigadier generals and 2 and 3 stars as well. So my population at the War College is significantly different in a number of ways from the population here at Annapolis. So if you look at this pyramid that I have up here, and if you were to draw a little line across the top pointy end up there, those are the folks that I'm dealing with. And why is that important? Well, it's important because those people they are already senior leaders. They have been selected and reselected and reselected, and they've been in their profession. And there was one of the speakers earlier spoke a little bit about the issue of expertise. And expertise is indeed domain specific. So we are at this point well beyond the 10,000 hours, 10-year limit. We are dealing with people who have been in the armed forces for 20 years and more, and who, if they are going to become experts, are experts. If they're not experts by this point, they're not ever going to be experts. They may be competent. They may be highly competent practitioners, but they're never going to become experts if they're not experts already. So there's less variability in that group than in the group at the bottom of the stack. I was asked to come up with a way of providing additional information about these senior leaders. And what I came up with was this senior leader, whole leader profile. You see up the left-hand side is the career performance history, And then we began to look at different elements that we could assess in these senior leaders that might be of value in future decisions about their careers, potentially at some point following validation, but certainly just more general information that could be added, not in isolation, but in harmony with their career performance history. And we settled on the 4 things that you see at the top, which we euphemistically call IQ, EQ, CQ, and LQ. And if you can read the slide, basically we're talking about cognitive functions at the top: fluid intelligence, critical thinking, strategic thinking, those kinds of things, judgment in the IQ box, personality, risk and uncertainty tolerance, empathy, leadership skills, those kinds of things as we come down to EQ. CQ is cultural competence, multicultural competence, which becomes ever more important as our leaders move up in rank, and they have to deal more and more with other services in the joint situation and coalition, not to mention host nations and so on. And then LQ at the bottom, leadership intelligence. This is a holistic view. It is not a bunch of numbers that they are getting assigned to them, so that Colonel so-and-so got a 95 and somebody else got an 83, so the guy with the 95 should get it. There's an acknowledgement, and you'll see it on the following slide, that all of these things interact. Now, in speaking with my learned colleague here to my right, Dr. Pfaff, and also I'd like to give a nod to, a significant nod to Pat Toffler and Brian DeCoster up at Cape, sir. The issue of whether or not moral intelligence, as we called it, and we could have called it something else, but then I would have had to come up with another letter, and it was just so much easier to have all the cues. That was an attempt at honesty, you know, which is, I'm told is a virtue. Anyway, that we should add this because the notion of moral leadership as one of the leadership attributes is so incredibly important. How to go about doing that, however, is a significant challenge. Assessments, general kinds of assessments that you find out there across psychology are cognitive and non-cognitive, and they assess different kinds of abilities, as I had mentioned before. However, in reality, within the individual, these are integrated, and in fact, they're interactive, such that intellectual function, as many of you know, can overrule an affective, that's an emotional response. Likewise, an overly strong emotional response can interfere with and perhaps reduce cognitive function, although motivation can sometimes compensate for some cognitive deficits. But the issue is where in this mix, which is the known mix, there are any number of these assessments out there, not that they're appropriate for my population, but there's any number of them out there. Where in the midst of all this does moral character lie within this interaction? And this was the main challenge that we had to face. So some challenges, well, actually, no, I have 10. You ended early. Anyway, challenges of studying moral character. So the first one, the most obvious one, is avoiding demand characteristics. Now, a demand characteristic is getting people telling you what they think they want, that you want to hear. So if I ask people if they're moral and they aspire to be a military leader, they're certainly going to tell me yes. And if they can get their hands on the list that CAPE has produced, or any of the other hundreds and perhaps thousands of pages written on this topic just in the last 50 years, let alone reaching all the way back to Aristotle and his peers, they can certainly tell me what they think I want to hear. So we had to come up with a way to get around that. Semantics, we've talked about that. Others have talked about that today. Lack of shared and accepted definitions. We're taking a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach. In other words, we're trying to find out what the leaders of today actually think, not what they're supposed to think, and how they prioritize, if you will, and value these attributes. Core versus derivative, my learned colleague taught me all about this, and this is this idea that while and forgive me, as I've already said, I'm not a philosopher, so perhaps I don't have a right to an opinion, but as I listened to it, the idea of unity of virtue did not appeal to me at all. This notion, however, that there may be both core and derivative virtues, and what you see up here is just an example of that, which is if you're going to have speaks truth to power, it presupposes that, first of all, you know what truth is and you give a damn. And secondly, that you have the courage to speak up. And I would also contend that speaking truth to power requires some judgment, because just because it's true doesn't mean that you can say it any old time. There's a way and a time to say it if you actually want to create power out of it. But these are significant challenges. Moving along, morality meets complex reality, attribute versus action. Another example, follows the rules, does not in itself, while appearing to match the Army ethic, does not necessarily mean that you believe in the rule. Creating, to my colleague over here, it's unfair, I'm speaking to her and she's yeah. The idea that was put forward earlier about holding people accountable and about there being some sort of price for failing to live up to the standard, while appealing. I'm not entirely sure, and I'd like to continue that dialogue with you. There can be an appearance, is my point. There could be an appearance of morality that, in fact, doesn't reflect anything that's held below. And as Dr. Pfaff said, one can do something that appears immoral and in fact does comport with the internal moral code. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And then finally on this page, deciding is also an action. From my perspective as a cognitive psychologist, a decision is an action, and all actions are preceded by decisions. Whether or not those decisions happen at the level of your consciousness or not is another issue. And there's, because of the time, I'm just going to kind of jump over. You can read through these, but there are all kinds of things that can impact those decisions, the availability and accuracy of information, levels of experience and expertise, which I said are not synonymous, and operational goals and moral attributes may appear to be in conflict. So, what did we do? Well, we had to do something, and this is what we decided to try. Our first ploy at this was to examine the issue of whether or not morality and moral attributes actually vary by context within the minds and the attitudes of our own leaders. Not whether or not they should, just do they. And so what we had them do, we developed a list of attributes, all of which, remember the demand characteristic, having them tell you what you want to hear? So basically everything we had on the list was good. Nothing on the list was bad. There were no bad answers here. And what we did was we showed them a list of 30 attributes, some of which are primarily leadership attributes, most of which were moral attributes, either core or derivative. And there were one or two foils in there, like follow the rules. And we asked them, and this was computer-driven, so they were not able to examine all of these simultaneously. They were presented one at a time with 30 of these attributes. And they were asked within a context, first the conventional warfare context, to rate how important that attribute was to leadership within that context. And they went through the list. And for those of you who don't know and can't guess, humans cannot hold 30 scores in their head simultaneously while reading the next one and moving on. So no, they really were not that impacted by the way that they'd scored the one before as they moved through that list. Once they'd done that, we had them do the whole thing again for the irregular warfare context and then again for the peacekeeping context. I haven't marked all the changes that happened, all the priorities that shifted, because it would look like spaghetti. But I just put up here the top 10 or so of the scores and show you that, and the biggest message just to take away from this is that the relative importance appeared to change for them as they moved from context to context. And the implication is that as the priorities may change in different environments, the influence of one over the other may result in different decisions which they would perceive as equally moral. Okay, now I have to move. So now my extra time's even used up. Yeah, 2 minutes. All right, so we're really going to zoom here. The next thing that we did actually speaks to this idea of exemplars. And I will confess that I was not aware of, from the philosophical perspective, of this theory about using the exemplar. I simply was implementing a psychological premise here. And that is that which we most admire is an indication of our own behavioral aspirations. And I want to introduce another term here, which is cognitive dissonance. There was discussion about, for example, the 2 German soldiers and whether or not they were, after the fact, justifying what they had done. And the answer is, of course they were, and so would we. For the most part, it is a known and well accepted and well understood phenomenon that when action and declared position differ, we suffer cognitive dominance, and cognitive dominance is really uncomfortable. And if you can't take back the action, the only thing you can do is change your attitude and come up with a rationale for why you did it that doesn't make you a horrific person. Now, some people fail to do that, and even some of those who do make the excuse still suffer the moral injury. But nonetheless, it's a well-known thing. So what I want to show you here is they were then asked, after they'd gone through this and they'd been familiar with the 30 item attributes, they were asked to think about the single individual whom they had known in their career, one person, not an amalgam, that one person that they had most admired in their career, and to choose the 5 descriptors from that list that most characterized that person. They did that. A new screen came up. The 5 that they had chosen were there, and they were asked to rank them 1 to 5 of these 5 that you've selected. Because, obviously they're reading down, so we don't get an order out of that. And this is what we came up with. And so the takeaways I don't have time to go into in great detail, but just take a look. And what you see in the top 5 here, judgment was the big winner. And judgment, one could argue, moral judgment, of course, is one thing, but judgment just as a military leader is something that is really paramount. And positivity is not in and of itself a moral attribute. So two out of the top 5 that they selected were leadership attributes, if you will, but not necessarily those which were moral. Don't have time to dwell too much more on that. The runners-up, I just put these up just to make a quick point, and that is, here are things that really didn't get chosen. Despite the fact that some of them showed up as being in the top 10 of that which is important for a peacekeeping mission in a context, when they actually were called upon to talk about a person, a real person that they admired, that to which they might aspire, these didn't make the list. What that means is up for further discussion. And I'm running over. I will say just one more thing on this. This is a different study, the decision dominance study, which I'm leaning on here. And the main point, if you were to read the slide, is that in this study where we examined real decisions provided to us by the people who made them, and a lot of information about the environment and the context and so forth in which those decisions were made, we found a subset in which I would say innovation had been employed. Innovation is something that Chief of Staff of the Army said he really wants more of. When we found innovation, we almost always, not always, I don't have the numbers up here, found that although they had innovated, they didn't break the rules, they may have made a slight pretzel shape out of them, but they didn't break any rules. Even when it turned out really, really well, when we asked them how satisfied they were with the outcome, they beat themselves up significantly because they hadn't managed to do it inside the framework of how they perceive the Army. And final thoughts. There's a lot up there, and I don't have time to go through them. I will point again to the bottom. The key thing at the bottom, limitations of the data. This is preliminary. Don't take any of this to the bank. And I think if I just had to pick one thing on this slide to say, it would be that moral attributes were all rated as important, but context really matters, and priorities change. And with that, I leave you with my counterpoint to Jerry Seinfeld, which is Sitting Bull. Inside me, there are two dogs. Now, this is 200 years after Goethe, and I'm relatively certain that Sitting Bull had not actually read Goethe, and certainly not in the original German. But anyway, inside me, there are two dogs, or two souls in his breast. One is mean and evil, the other is good, and they fight each other all the time. And when asked which one wins, I answer, the one I feed the most. And my question to all of you is, are there three dogs? There's the character they bring with them. There's the character and the Army ethic that we want to employ into them. We want to feed the good dog. And are these two united or integrated at some point in fighting the bad dog?
Okay, so we're in the home stretch, so hang in there, all right? I have the privilege of being a senior fellow here at the Stockdale Center. And as Shannon French was kind enough to mention, I'm going to discuss some work that Captain Kevin Mullaney, who's a professor here at the Academy, and I are working on. We actually have a piece coming out in the next journal, I believe, of military ethics. I'm going to take as my point of departure some of the comments that General Miller and Dr. French made with regard to the way in which threats and challenges may be evolving and the need, perhaps in some cases, to rethink military virtues or perhaps to reformulate virtues in ways that are sensitive to those kinds of challenges and threats and the kinds of situations that people will be finding themselves in. My focus is going to be on asymmetric conflict. Conflict in which combatants and civilians are embedded with one another. This obviously has been an increasing form of conflict over the last several years. It creates some significant challenges. And one issue, and one that I think we need to confront when we're talking about military ethics education, is how might we inculcate appropriate responses that often have to be immediate, non-conscious, unthinking, in situations in which it can be extraordinarily difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians. So I'm going to take you to the first minute of the incident involving U.S. Marines in Haditha and Anbar province in November 2005. It's a scenario with which I know many of you are familiar. There's a convoy of 4 U.S. Marine vehicles containing Marines and friendly Iraqi soldiers returning to its base after resupplying a checkpoint. The leader of the squad was Sergeant Frank Wuderick. Shortly after 0700, an improvised explosive device detonated beneath the vehicle, some 35 meters behind Wuderick. The vehicle was blown in the air, killing one Marine, seriously injuring another. Wuderick immediately pulls his vehicle over to the side of the road, to the herringbone position. The first thing he saw was 5 young men standing about 10 meters away by the side of a car, a sedan. They were unarmed. They made no move to advance toward him, nor did they exhibit any overt hostile behavior. And Wuderick described what happened next. I took a knee in the road and fired. Engaging was the only choice. The threat had to be neutralized. The 5 men whom Wuderick killed were 4 college students and a driver they had hired to take them to classes. The white car was in effect a taxi, although it wasn't marked as such. No weapons were found in the car. No more than a minute at most had passed between the IED explosion and when Wuderich opened fire. Now, if we evaluate those events, one natural description is Wuderich was simply overcome by his emotions. Emotions of anger, fear, desire for revenge, right? And this reflects a failure of reason to control emotions. And there's certainly much plausibility in that account, that description. But I want to suggest that recent research in neuroscience and in psychology suggests that we can also describe the events as ones in which Wuderich failed to respond with the right emotions. Contrast Wuderich's reaction with Hugh Thompson, the pilot who intervened to stop the massacre at My Lai and to rescue civilians. Thompson was moved by a sense of angry outrage. He said, I said, damn it, it ain't gonna happen. They ain't gonna die. I was hot, I'll tell you that. Those who got his radio message reported his voice was choked with emotion. He swore obscenities, cursed, pleaded with the aircrew to help. We could say that Thompson exhibited the right kind of emotion in those circumstances. And the right kind of emotion can not only signal the presence that there's something of moral significance in the situation that we face, it can also move us to act, to take appropriate steps. Hugh Thompson's emotional response led him to intervene to stop the massacre at considerable personal risk. So what would it have meant for Wuderich to respond with the right emotion? It would mean that he responded not only with anger and fear, which is natural, but with emotional aversion to the prospect of killing innocent civilians. This could have led him to take perhaps just a few more seconds to seek additional information about the men, right? Had anyone seen them before the explosion? In fact, someone had seen them approach the convoy and had waved them to the side, and they complied with that directive. Instead of relying on his colleagues' broken Arabic and yelling at the men, he could have turned to the Iraqi soldiers in the unit and asked them to communicate with them. He could have taken a few seconds to consider anyone triggering an IED likely would be moving away from the site of the explosion than toward it. In other words, this sort of emotional reaction could have led him to take steps that would have avoided the deaths of 5 innocent men. And thinking of the situation in this way is consistent with research findings that what we traditionally call emotional processing has a powerful influence on moral perception, judgment, and behavior. This is especially the case in situations that require immediate, non-conscious responses. Right? Our sense that a situation has morally significant features, our assessment of how to weigh those features, and our effort to respond in a way that we believe is morally appropriate are all the product of a process that computes the strength of signals in the brain, representing the emotional valence that we attach to different features of the situation. The neural structure that is central in this process is something, it's a mouthful. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VmPFC. This system plays a key role in enabling us to make practical choices that are beneficial rather than harmful to us, based on the emotions that we anticipate are likely to result from choosing different courses of action. When this system is impaired, the VmPFC, an individual is fully able to engage in complex logical reasoning, to understand principles, but is unable to apply the results of that logical reasoning to make good decisions in his or her own life. People with impaired VmPFC lack any sense of the practical rewards or penalties that are likely to result from choosing different courses of behavior. Indeed, they often make choices that are quite detrimental, quite disastrous to their well-being. In particular, They're able to understand moral principles and engage in reasoned moral deliberation. But they're incapable of acting on the basis of those principles, of applying them in real life. They often engage in morally problematic behavior even though they fully understand intellectually what it means to act morally. So what is it that the VmPFC does? Well, this is going to, if there are any neuroscientists in the room, I'm going to make an immediate disclaimer. This is highly simplified. When we encounter a situation, various structures in the brain respond by sending signals to the VmPFC that reflect the emotional significance of the situation based on past experience with situations that seem similar. So there's one neural structure that processes information about others' emotional states, others that ascribe beliefs and intentions to others, another involved in logical deliberation. These signals reflect a positive or negative emotional valence, if you will, associated with particular features of a situation, adjusted by the probability of their occurrence. So, for example, in situations involving decisions whether or not to give to charity, willingness to give is correlated with activity in these neural structures that incorporates information that involves processing information about the desires and intentions of others, and another involved in empathic identification. All these signals, and there are multiple of them in any given instance, are ultimately represented in the VmPFC, which then integrates them, these expected emotional valences, into a common currency that guides comparison and choice among different alternatives. It assigns cardinal values to potential courses of action in order to compare the magnitude of expected rewards or penalties. The result is the assignment of expected reward values to various sorts of alternatives, and then it generates a signal, an emotional signal that moves us to select the course of action with the highest expected emotional reward. Okay? This process often is virtually instantaneous, especially in situations involving social relationships where we have to read complex social cues. So this may make it seem like it's sort of instinctive. It involves no cognitive process, really. But in fact, it reflects complex computational processes. Right? It's immediate and non-conscious, yet it involves interaction among several neural structures. This process also involves learning. The VmPFC sends the signal, we choose a certain course of action, we then assess what in fact are the emotional consequences compared to what was predicted or projected by the VmPFC. To the extent there's a divergence, this information is fed back into the neural structures, right? And they then adjust projections of expected value in future situations that resemble this one. Now, I've used the term emotional processing, but in fact the process has features of both of what we think of as emotion and deliberation. On the one hand, interpretation and response to a situation are guided by projection of emotional consequences, but the process is one in which neural structures represent states of the world and engage in calculation and comparison of the emotional valence connected with each. So, what does all this non-conscious computational processing have to do with morality? Well, positive and emotional values associated with social situations and negative ones can reflect a response to their morally salient features. So, for instance, perceptions that are attuned to others' experience, guided by appreciation of their projected mental states, can lead us to identify or project pain or distress, while empathy can generate negative emotional signals that lead us to want to relieve it. This suggests, I think, that cultivating the ability to respond in morally appropriate ways to social situations requires that we engage our emotions to refine our perceptions and judgments. Ideally, the emotional values generated by the neural structures that I've described, that provide inputs to the VmPFC, would reflect morally salient features of a situation. Ideally, the VmPFC would engage in a computational process that generates a negative emotional signal in anticipating the consequences of acting in a morally problematic way, and a positive one for morally appropriate sorts of responses. So it seems to me one crucial question for ethical education is how can we ensure that the emotional signals sent by neural structures in different situations will in fact incorporate these positive and negative values based on appreciation of morally salient features of a situation. And this question, of course, is especially crucial for military ethics training because members of the armed forces often have to engage in split-second decisions that involve and engage the non-conscious process that I've described. How can we ensure that servicemen and women will have the right emotional response that is understood as one that is morally appropriate? I think that ethics training that enhances the capacity for deliberation will not be enough if we don't educate the emotions as well. And I think it's fair to say that the military to some degree is ambivalent about emotion. On the one hand, as Nancy Sherman has described, there's a strong stoic influence in the military. It regards emotions as unruly influences that can interfere with the need for self-control in the midst of highly stressful situations. So that emphasizes the importance of controlling and regulating emotion, keeping them in check in order to act ethically. On the other hand, because military operations, especially combat, especially asymmetric situations, often rely on rapid non-conscious responses to situation, I've observed that a considerable amount of military training now, particularly immediate pre-deployment, involves simulation of circumstances so that personnel acquire the ability to respond automatically under pressure in different ways. So the exercises at 29 Palms, for instance, with the U.S. Marine Corps, involve a fairly significant sort of recreation of the kinds of actual context that people are going to be in. In addition, think about it. The military takes complete strangers and molds them into units whose members are bound by deep personal ties that can lead them to sacrifice their lives to one another. That has to have an emotional component to it. That can't be simply the product of intellectual deliberation. So I think this sort of process of engaging emotion while also focusing on deliberation, we can think of as a form of habituation, following Aristotle. For Aristotle, habituation to virtue was not simply a matter of instilling automatic responses to specific stimuli. Rather, it involved a combination of affect and deliberation that's guided by keen discernment of features of a situation. As Aristotle said in assessing virtue, we must take someone's pleasure or pain following on his actions to be a sign of his state. For pleasure causes us to do base actions, and pain causes us to abstain from fine ones. That is why we need to have had the appropriate upbringing to make us find enjoyment or pain in the right things. For this is the correct education. And that strikes me as a form of educating the emotions, right? And as Nancy Sherman notes, for instance, for Aristotle, moral motives are importantly constituted by the emotions. There's no separate source of motives such as Kant's practical reason from which morality can issue. And this all seems to me consistent with neuroscientific research that suggests the crucial role of assessing expected emotional rewards or penalties in responding to situations with morally salient features. So how might we do that? So in just a couple minutes as I close, how would this apply to Sergeant Woodring? Right? Well, in asymmetric conflicts, obviously we want combatants to respond non-consciously with emotional aversion to the prospect of civilian deaths. That, of course, is a response that traditionally is easier to exhibit when you've got segregated battlefields in traditional sorts of conflicts, right? But now these sensibilities have to be honed perhaps in a way that they hadn't before, right? Service members sometimes regard local populations with indifference at best or resentment at worst, right? Residents may fail to respond to friendly overtures. They may refuse to provide information. They may openly express hostility. And service members often feel they're risking their lives to protect people who are ungrateful, who maybe are collaborating with the enemy to put their lives and their comrades' lives at risk. Right? That is not a sort of climate, that's not a set of attitudes that's going to be conducive to an immediate emotional aversion to the death of civilians. Right? So it can be valuable to educate forces about, in fact, the vulnerability of the local population, the way in which they are caught between coalition forces and insurgents, the way in which tribal ties, family ties, a whole range of sorts of relationships can make fear of retaliation a concern, skepticism about how long coalition forces will be there, about whether, in fact, insurgents will be able to regain the initiative, and a whole range of things can, in other words, create some sense of empathy. Right? And this is a way of educating the emotions, I think. And an NCO, a commanding officer, could simply sit down and relate this and describe this. Right? So this is a process of activating, a process of reflective deliberation that then culminates, ideally, in a stronger emotional response, a stronger emotional aversion to harming innocent civilians. So Kevin and I think that this line of research on neuroscience and moral perception, decision-making, judgment can be especially valuable in light of the increasing number of asymmetric conflicts. But I would suggest also, again, going back to the remarks of General Miller and Dr. French, to the extent we think that the nature of threats and challenges as they evolve will also require us rethinking virtues. You know, how can we engage emotion in a way that is sensitive to the kinds of new contexts in which service members will be operating, right? So I'll close with a quote from someone who served in Anbar province, who said this: "The junior subordinate leader has to make a decision in a split second or a series of seconds where he does a calculus, a balancing of the safety of Marines, the accomplishment of his mission, the threat level of the enemy, and collateral damage. He has to make this decision in seconds without hesitation. In the difference between murder and killing, he is judge and jury in that split second." Thank you.
All right, I think we have a few, where's Ed? A few minutes for questions? 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Randy.
Yeah, I have a question for Colonel Catlett about military profession. Some years ago, I was assigned the task of teaching professional ethics. I knew a lot about ethics, but not about professional ethics. I went and looked at the literature, my textbooks that I had designed, but also the sociological literature. And I found incredible agreement about what constituted a profession. And they were specialized training or education, an ethical code, licensing or entry criteria. So far, notice the military passes the final codes. Then, entry is voluntary. The other professions will have to require you aren't ordered to adopt others. Their codes and their standards evolved over time, in some cases hundreds or thousands of years, and they were all self-regulated in a democratic way. Now these paradigm professions are medicine, law, human accounting, education, and many others. Now I submit that the military profession is not paradigmatic in the way the others are, and that I'm a little bit disturbed about the fact that it isn't self-regulated. Now, why you want a profession to be self-regulated is because then the professionals own the they developed it as a new code. So I wonder if it might, if character development and professional codes might be helped by avoiding the top-down.
Was that a question in reference to top-down approach? I'm not quite sure I follow you on.
Well, the code, the military code,
Right.
is developed by the Department of Army. And then it's transmitted and published
Right.
to the enlisted soldiers.
Right. Well, I mean, you have to develop, the profession has to develop its code in which it then transmits and socializes the aspiring professional into the organization. It would seem problematic if you were looking to the aspiring professional to define the code of the profession that they were joining. If maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but I just wanted to maybe push back for a second on your comment that we're not self-regulating. I don't agree with that. We are self-policing. We have our own Uniform Code of Military Justice, which empowers us to try and convict and imprison those who, violate that. And that code is, well, clearly very similar with civilian code law. It has many unique aspects, and not to mention, if you read the preamble areas of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, its fundamental reason for existing is to enforce good order and discipline in organizations, which is not why, that is a very much the professional ethic and the end state of the profession being promulgated. And so I do believe that we are self-regulating in that, and many other ways too. I mean, we're given a profound amount of autonomy by Congress to do the things that we do.
Have legal constraints as well.
Yeah, well, okay.
However, they develop an ethical code themselves, not the legal code, but the ethical code they own. And that's not true of the Army.
One last response if you want, and then we'll move on to the next question. Yeah, I'll do a response. I don't know that that's true. I mean, I'm with Geoff here. The ethical codes we're coming up with are all done by, military people. Now, yeah, the privates may not get a vote. We can talk about there's a level at which you enter the profession, beyond just simply entering, joining the military. We could talk about that, but ultimately the codes we're talking about are all under development by people in the military with military experience. Would be my response. But we do want to get to other questions. Come on.
Yep. Thanks for your excellent presentations. Professor Regan, as a psychiatrist, my concern about the neurobiological hypothesis is that, first of all, when the brain gets flooded in alarm, it really isn't processing. So it ought to be processing, but it's not. And so I have a little bit of a concern about whether there's processing going on, but you can't act on it. There is a stroke syndrome that goes along with that, but again, I have concerns about that. But the larger issue for me is what it seems you're saying is essentially a biological basis for not guilty by reason of insanity. That's really what you're saying. Temporary insanity caused this action to happen. And yet what you seem to be saying also, by your reasoning, is that if moral reasoning is going on in that part of the brain, and you couldn't act on it, you're saying, well, not guilty by reason of insanity, but guilty by reason of moral reasoning. In other words, so the person is really doomed to a life of suffering, recognizing that they should have acted differently but didn't.
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't really take a position on responsibility in the article. We're just attempting to try to sort of understand some of these processes. And I guess, our point essentially is we can think of this as a process in a sense of moral reasoning. We can think of the emotion as the end product, right, of ideally an earlier, more reflective, deliberate process, right, that attempts to sort of inculcate appropriate emotional responses. And so in that sense, it's not the case we're talking simply about sort of brute instinctive responses, right? That there is some complex cognitive processing that goes on. I mean, I certainly appreciate that in situations of stress, there are obstacles and challenges and difficulties, right? And yet at the same time, I think we at least hope and expect people to act appropriately, especially in those sorts of circumstances. And indeed, that's where it's particularly important, right? The question of responsibility, difficult to say. I don't know, but I don't necessarily think that providing, what may be a descriptive account, it's a hypothesis, right, would necessarily, exonerate someone. I mean, I'm certainly not a determinist, right, and I don't mean for that account to be the case. But I'd love to follow up with you. My thoughts on that.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
For your presentation, thank you very much. A couple of things I'd be interested in your comments. I spent 3 hours yesterday going through a lot of these issues with a bunch of PhD students. And two things that came up were interesting. The first one was for every ethical decision, there tends to be 2 or 3 ethical options available, not just one. So often you're picking the least best scenario or whatever, say that. That changes your processing considerably. The second issue is it seems to me, is almost all the ethical issues that people who we train are going to be involved in have nothing to do with combat at all. We tend to use those because they're sexy and they're cool, but at the end of the day, we're talking, we're talking about efficiency report inflation. We're talking about supply stuff. We're talking about getting around, going around, to get along. Which are not different because there are ethical issues, but there are different considerations for time, et cetera. I wonder if you can comment.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. And, the kind of example I've given is perhaps maybe the most striking. But in everyday organizational life, people can deal with issues and yet not recognize that they're dealing with issues or not involved in situations that have ethical salience. Right? There can be a way in which they're simply not sensitive to it. Right? And I think that even though we're talking about situations in which there is more time for deliberation, I think the emotions are significant throughout our lives, not simply where we have to make split-second decisions. I think that our orientation toward the world and our kind of mental map of the world is guided very much by emotions. And so I think educating emotions can also be valuable in those contexts as well. Certainly, for instance, in sensitizing people to the fact that different kinds of situations that do in fact have a moral dimension, I would say.
All right, I think we got time for one more. Yes, sir.
I'm going to jump on the Mitt train as well. Mitt, thank you for your talk. You talked about the importance of moral habituation in high stress, time-compressed situations. Give a good example of how commanders can help their troops downrange think these things through. But you also gestured to the importance of upbringing. And just like the time to develop a sexual ethic is not the backseat of a car, being downrange is probably not the time to think about the ethics of killing and warfighting. And wanting to push back against the potential obsolescence of parents, what sort of advice might you have in helping parents morally form their children to become the kinds of men and women who can fight our wars with probity and honor?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. And, one of the things Kevin and I are trying to look at is, well, how does moral learning occur? That is, if ideally you want positive or negative emotional values as part of this cognitive processing system, well, how is it, how do you get that content into the system, right? And that's a process of what's called moral learning, essentially. And there's been some recent work on that. And the answer is there really is no one way. But again, they find that often parents actually intuitively are pretty good at this, where they rely particularly on, say, empathy, for instance, right? you did this, think about how this person feels and so forth. And there's some literature, and I'm not really qualified to say with any definitively, but there's some literature that suggests that empathy is in many ways sort of a foundational sort of emotional response, right? It's sufficient, or it's necessary, it may not be sufficient, but it may be a foundation on which other more complex sort of emotional responses can work. And then there's one strand of the literature focuses on what's called outcome aversion and action aversion. So outcome aversion is something that reflects empathic identification with, say, the victim of harm, right? And that may be, again, foundational, but eventually then there seems to be a process in which people internalize that as wrong and then come to have an emotional aversion to the prospect of them doing something like that. So one of the examples is they give someone the role-playing scenario where someone has a rubber knife, I think it is, right? And they find that people, have aversion to the sort of the outcome of sort of simulating cutting someone's throat, even though they know there's not going to be any harm that results. Okay? So we might think, well, this emotional aversion doesn't really reflect empathy because there really is no injury that's going to be occurred. But they find that the notion that they're the sort of person who actually would do this is somehow related to their sense of identity. And so this goes a bit beyond parents, but I think it could be relevant. But certainly for the military, the notion of what does it mean to be a member of the armed forces? What is your moral identity, right? And this is something Shannon has written on quite a bit, right? And so again, as we're thinking of different military virtues, it was controversial, but General McChrystal, in his tactical directive limiting close air support in Afghanistan, used the term courageous restraint. And he was trying to formulate a virtue in the context that would be functional in counterinsurgency, right? And say what it means to wear the uniform is to be willing to assume a certain amount of risk for the sake of saving civilian lives. So I think it's a really interesting area that I think we're hoping to do more work on, I think. But again, the question is, even if this process is accurate, how do you, and that's of course the whole question with respect to education, how do you get those inputs, if you will, into the system in the first place?
Okay, back to you, Ed.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for the entertainment included. And thank you, the entire panel. I was talking to the Freemans earlier, and we were talking about the temptation to be pessimistic about our society, but here we have leaders in the professions of the military and Mitt with law, and among you psychologists, and then future leaders in the audience so concerned with ethics and virtue, and that's, I think, cause for some optimism. So thank you for that. Thank you for your work. So our next step is to go over to the visitor center, and there'll be a reception there with